Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today I'm bringing you part 2 of my Elites tier list series. Today we're going to be looking at the United States, and for a lot of reasons I think this one might be the hardest to do out of all of them, just because the US has a lot of, more so than any other class, a lot of deck-specific elites. Like, you have a lot of elites which are very, very clearly defined like ramp cards. Like you have cards that like can't even be used without ramp, for example, or at least not used to their full potential. So there's a lot of very deck specific elites, and it's for a deck which is not particularly good or popular. Um, so it's kind of hard to judge. And then you have a bunch of elites which are like good, but they're good because the United States lacks a ton of um, like it is lacking in a lot of areas, so it's good, but like if it was a British card or a German card, would it actually be run? Would it still be considered good if it just not because it's a US card? Um, so I'm using the same metric as the last one. It's written on the side. Um, that's just how I'm going to define it. You can define a card's tier list in a lot of different ways. Like just based on what's your personal preference to play with, or based on how common it is in the current meta. That one's probably the easiest and most objective way to do it. However, I like to. It creates a bit of spice if I do it based on how strong I think the card is on its own and how much room it has to grow into the future. Um, so, starting off with 101st Airborne, this is a card that I'm going to put in A tier. Um, I mean, I think it's low A, high B. It's a card which I think is just going to get worse and worse as expansions go on. Like, it's fine. I've already been cutting it from a lot of my US mid-range decks. I've been cutting it from a lot of my ramp decks. It's just 2 damage to the support line does not mean as much now as it used to mean. There's just a lot of 3 or 4 health units in the support line now. There's very, very rarely a 2 health unit in the support line. Um, 4 to the front line is good, but like if you want 4 to the front line, why aren't you just gonna run like a 5th Rangers? It's cheaper, significantly, and it has the potential to be huge in the late game. Um, so like 101st, it's sort of just getting outclassed and it's fallen out of the meta. However, its stat line is really decent. I think of it sort of as like the same type of card as the Egg Bomber, where it's like it's not anything flashy. It's just sort of like a good value effect, which is always going to be fine in basically any matchup, even if it's not like winning you the game. Although it's very clearly significantly worse than the Egg Bomber. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it in. Well, huh. Um, I'm actually gonna drop it to B. I might move it up to A. We will see. Again, US is really hard. Um, Next up, a few good men. Now, if you just take a quick look at the US units, you have B-17F, Black Widow, Catalina, Chaffy, 101st, the F Hellcat, Jasco, Long Tom, Marauder, Medical Battalion, P-40, Pershing, PIR, Skytrain, Super Fortress. So, in other words, you have 3 ludicrously expensive cards you can only play with ramp, and are just ludicrously expensive. You have like 3 or 4 kind of all right on their own mid-range units. You have like 101st, which is probably like by far the most safe pick off of it, and then you have like a bunch of very, very situational cards like Medical Battalion or Jasco, and then you just have a handful of like just absolutely awful cards, which are almost never going to be picked. So I think A Few Good Men is by far the worst. Well, maybe it's better than Soul of Old Japan. Um, maybe no, because that's the other thing. There's no shortage of like good, expensive cards you want to run in ramp. Um, so like, why would you ever run a card that like only sometimes gives you an expensive card when you can just run an actual expensive card? I mean, I guess like 5% of the time you get a second Jasco off it against an aggro deck, and then you're happy. But that is not enough of a reason to run the card. I'm just gonna leave it down in terrible. There's just too many cards that dilute the options, which means that it will never get better in the future. Even if like all of the US units they add for the next like 2 or 3 expansions are just absolutely insane, you still wouldn't run this card just because there's so many cards you do not want to get. Um, so next up is air defense. This is one of the ones that I talked about, that I was sort of referring to when I talked about cards, which it's sort of, you have to ask how good would it be outside of US. Um, so US has no guards, so it's very weak to burst, and it also has very, very limited good removal. And air defense sort of like, you use it as removal, and it also sort of doubles as protection from a lot of bursts. But like, how good is it actually? Um, I'm tempted to just leave it an A. You do 2 costs for 3 damage is really good. And it's a 2 cost countermeasure. 2 is at a cost where you can be holding it up several turns in a row. But like, compare this to From the Deep. Um, it's very easy for your opponent to just not attack. If they see you have passed with 2 credits up, they can not attack and then spend their credits on developing the board. And there's very few ways as a US player you can have to punish that. However, with From the Deep, it's very, very, very easy to put your opponent into a situation where their choices are play something into From the Deep or pass. And if they pass, you're obviously going to then go on and probably win the game. So From the Deep is basically 2 credit countermeasure, destroy the weakest unit in their hand. Which, 2 costs, destroy the weakest unit in their hand, and depending on what you're playing against, that's really, really good. Whereas air defense is like 2 cost, you deal 3 damage to a unit of your opponent's choice, if they choose to attack. And if not, you have to pay for this again. Which is like exceptionally mediocre. I mean, it's really nice to just like run as a one of, just because there's so many like random blitz planes that are out and about, but that is very meta dependent. I think I'm gonna put air defense down to B. I mean, it's actually kind of similar to 101st, where it's like I see why people run it, but I feel like just in the future it's gonna get worse and worse. Although actually with air defense, there's a possibility that it gets better if, like depending on how the meta is behaving. Whereas 101st, it's not a meta dependent card. Air defense is very much a meta dependent card. Then we get to B17F. This is definitely going to the far end of B tier. It's an alright card. I'm not even like 100% convinced it's better than B17, just the straight up B17. Flying Fortress, or like Avenger. There's definitely a ramp deck where you would run all of those. Like, I think it's better than Pershing. It's miles better than Super Fortress. However, it's sort of like an okay card in a currently weak deck. And again, US has no guard, so it's difficult to protect this. And 13 credits you have to be committing real hard to go in for 13 credits. Like, you have to be confident your opponent doesn't have a countermeasure that destroys it when you play it, or a countermeasure that destroys it when you attack with it. Um, yeah, you have to be very safe to do this, or in a position where you don't care about not getting a ton of value out of a 13 card credit card. In which case, I mean, you are playing ramp, so like maybe that works, but I think it's a fine card if you want to play a ramp deck, but it's not a good card. It's not a card that pushes ramp forward, if that makes sense. Then we get to Black Widow. Black Widow is a very interesting card. Before the change, it sucked absolute crap and would easily be down in like C tier or D tier. After the change, which makes it now say at the start of your turn, give a random. I'm not sure if it's a random fighter or a random plane. I think it's a random fighter. Immune for this turn. So it can target itself. So if it sticks, it's essentially a 5 cost 4/5 fighter with immune on your turn, which is comparable to Goshiken, except Goshiken's a 6/4 and it's always on itself. It doesn't have the possibility of giving it to another unit. I can't imagine that you really care about giving it to another unit because Black Widow has to stick for the effect to trigger, and it's very, very unlikely you have a fighter that you would rather have immune on than Black Widow, since you don't want to lose Black Widow by attacking, like trading in. Um, and also it's a 4/5, and like you're probably not running the 5/5/7 cost US Spitfire. Um, so with that being said, it's sort of like a weird, slightly different statted Goshiken. And Goshiken's a good card. Goshiken, I think, is a pretty good card. It's been run in various different metas. So where does Black Widow line up compared to that? I mean, I think it's actually worse than Goshiken, and it's difficult to imagine putting it into a deck, but I don't think it's terrible, if that makes sense. Like, the problem with it is it doesn't do anything the turn it's played. It's not like a Jagd Bomber. It's not just like a well-statted plane that does something immediately. It's a well-statted plane which, if your opponent can't kill it, you can start getting value out of it. That's true for a lot of American elites, that they don't do anything the turn they're played, but if they stick around, they start getting better and better and better. The problem is, it's a card game. Your opponent's not just going to let you play units and let you keep them on board. Your opponent's going to play removal. Your opponent's going to trade. Your opponent's going to rush you down. Um, so with that being said, I'm not sure if I can justify putting it up at B. I mean, it's just sort of a subpar card. I'm going to put it down into C tier. Then we have Catalina. Um, Catalina is at the start of your turn, draw 2 cards, like draw 2 extra cards, and then choose 1 card in your hand to put onto the top of your deck. So this is a very good effect. Its stats are 3/4 Bomber, which is a little awkward. Obviously, when it was a 3/5, this card would have been probably S tier. At 3/5, it's really broken. 3/4 dies to a lot of things. Dies to Hellcat, dies to 5th Rangers, Sherman, 52k, Burning Skies, etc., 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 Comet. So it's a lot harder to use at 3/4, since it's a lot easier for your opponent to kill it with a single card the turn it's played, in which case it did nothing. However, the reward for getting it to stick is way better than the reward for getting Black Widow to stick, or as we'll see coming up, getting Long Tom to stick. So I think I'm gonna put it at A tier. I think it's one of the best, like, sort of mid-game elites the US has. I think it has opportunities to be run in US mid-range. I've certainly run it in US mid-range recently, and it was like a staple of US mid-range in the past. Lets you get a little extra more draw in there on top of the Shermans. And I don't think it's atrocious in like a control deck. there is the issue that you don't control how much you draw. So actually, a very frequent thing that happens is you leave your opponent with Catalina on board and let them draw and draw and draw and draw and draw, and then you win on fatigue. Um, Now, obviously, the upside of that is you have a 3/4 bomber on the board every turn, which usually turns things around. So yeah, I don't think it's high in A tier, but I do think I'd leave it in A tier for now. Then we get Chaffy, which is a hilariously bad card. Um, so 3 cost, 4/2 tank. When you move it to the front line, it summons a second Chaffy in the front line. Yeah, this is just an absolutely awful card. On its own, it's a card. The stats on the card is worth like 2 credits, and it's a 2 credit card you wouldn't run, but it's worth like 2 credits. So the effect of summoning a second in the front line is just so mind-bogglingly awful. Um, yeah, Chaffee's in D tier. It's actually worse than a few good men. Um, yeah, I think it's worse than a few good men. Then we get to Counterstrike. Counterstrike is a solid B tier card. 3 credits to hold up is a lot harder to do. Now, it's significantly more flexible than air defense since it straight up destroys a unit. It's good against control, and it's essentially like a very, very good tech card against a lot of forms of OTK since it's just straight up destroy a unit, which stops blitz units that are trying to OTK you. Now, where its weakness is against aggro decks or mid-range decks, because it's not difficult to have just like a crappy unit you will find attacking with first to trigger Counterstrike. That's not like a difficult situation to arise, in which case you're spending 3 credits to destroy a unit. And you have slightly greater control than for something from the deep, for example. So, since with from the deep, you have no idea what's in their hand. So for all you know, they have like a 1 cost unit they're trying to get rid of that's just in their hand. Whereas with Counter-Strike, you can just wait to hold it up when there's a board that is good for you to have Counter-Strike held up on. However, they can have blitz units from hand. They can just not attack, which again is sort of the problem with air defense. Not attacking means you're floating 3 credits, and it's the benefit with the US is you're probably running this in a ramp deck, in which case you will have a lot of extra credits. So it's easier to hide the fact that you are floating credits, and it's easier for you to afford to float credits holding this up if they don't trigger it. However, like if it's like an open deck list tournament situation, your opponent's just going to play around it, and you're not going to get a ton of value out of it. You're still probably going to run it for the time being, but how long into the future are you still going to run Counter-Strike? I'm not sure. Um, there's like no synergies. Like there's no lurking danger type of cards that like gives you any basic synergies for running countermeasures. You're basically just running this because there's no other unit or order that accomplishes a similar task. And in the future, I suspect there will be, in which case we will stop running Counter-Strike. Um, I think it's probably better than B17F, worse than 101st. I think I'd put it there. Again, still might change some of these around. Then we have the Hellcat, the F Hellcat. This card is, I mean, I'm sure like when you first started playing the game, you had a game where you got completely blown out by this. It's a 2 cost 1/2 fighter that gains +1/+1 every time it attacks, and it gains the stats before the combat damage resolves. So it attacks and deals 2 damage, and if you attack it, so for example, you can attack the 1/2 fighter into a 2/2 unit, and you will kill the unit, and yours will survive because it gains +1/+1, goes up to a 2/3, then it hits and deals 2, takes 2. So you've probably lost a game where you got snowballed out by this. However, it's a 2 cost, 2 health plane. It's really easy to kill. I don't think it's like absolutely awful if it's like the first elite you open and you want to just throw it in your deck. Like it's not a terrible card. It's a 2 cost card that has the potential to like snowball. or at the very least, like 2-for-1. However, you're not ever going to see this in any competitive lists because it's just not quite there. It's sort of a meh card. So I'm going to leave it down at C tier. I think it has slightly less potential to be run than Black Widow. However, if there's like some insane fighter synergies in the future, you might see this card pop up. Then we get on to High Altitude Bombing, which is also going to go into B tier, because this is a card where it's a very, very straightforward card. It's 8 cost to destroy 2 random enemy units. It's a ramp card. I mean, you could run it in like a control deck, or like a heavier mid-range if you really want to go that way. It's just sort of an okay card. Like, it fills the slot of removal. It can kill King Tigers and Panther Gs and whatnot. It's just not great. Like, it's slightly better than DFA, since the problem with DFA is that your opponent will almost always have at least a second unit. So with high altitude bombing, you can just be like, well, they have one really big unit and like a 1/1 token. I'm going to play high altitude bombing to get a guaranteed kill on the big unit. Also because it's like basically 2 DFAs in one card. So it means you only takes 1 slot from your deck. It means you only lose 1 card when you play it. So yeah, it's just like an okay card. It's not anything crazy. You're just gonna run into it because we don't have anything better at the moment. I think I'd probably put it above Counterstrike. I think it's still behind 101st and Air Defense though. It's just like a really mediocre card. I mean, I could even see putting it to the top of B, but we'll leave it there. Then we get to island hopping. This is the one I've been waiting for because I know exactly where I'm putting this, and I know this is probably going to be a little controversial. I'm putting island hopping at S tier. This card is absolutely insane. Just completely and utterly insane. So a +2/+2 stat buff is probably worth around 2 credits. Like 1 to 2 credits, 1.5 credits, sort of. So if you trigger this twice, you were already getting like going even on the value, except you've triggered it twice. So it's +4/+4 in 1 card. So like if you triggered this twice, you were already getting better than value. Like you're getting better value for the credits and number of cards you put into it. Now obviously there's the slight disadvantage of you don't choose where the buff goes onto, and you only get the buff if you can deal 3 damage to the opponent, or the opponent deals 3 damage to themselves. However, this card has so much potential because it doesn't matter if your opponent heals. Like, if you've ever played this card against Japan-France Resistance, or like Soviet-Italy Control, you know what I mean. You will trigger this card like 7, 8, 9 times in a game. That's +18/+18 in stats. That means every single time you have a 3 attack unit on the board, your opponent has to remove it at all costs, or it's going to turn into a 5 attack unit, then a 7 attack unit. It basically just makes every single card in your deck so much more threatening for your opponent. And yes, this is in specific matchups. A lot of times you'll like get this against Jagro and you'll trigger it like once and then you kill him or die. But it's just the fact that it is so powerful against control without being a completely dead card against midrange or aggro, or like any sort of mirror. And you can even run this card in control if you're running a very unit-based control. There is so much potential for this card, and it only gets better. Like going forward in the future, as you have more ways to trigger this, as you have more ways to find this early, maybe ways to discount it, maybe ways to get multiple copies. That would be pretty insane. Yeah, this is, in my opinion, by far the best of the give the enemy HQ when they take 3 damage cards. By far the best of them. This card is ludicrously powerful, and just because we don't see it in the current meta a ton, it's really only run in US German midrange. That's just because, I mean, that is a result of the current meta. But I do think this card is just so ludicrously powerful. That is why you run it in US midrange. Because I feel like US midrange is almost not there. Like US midrange has gotten a little faster in the current version than in the past. Like back when it ran California's Old California, um, island hopping was like a no-brainer in that deck. Now you still run it, even if the deck is faster, just because it's so good. This card is. It is difficult to explain how insane this card is. Not necessarily in the current game. I'm not saying go out there and craft this card immediately and put it in every single deck. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying the potential for this card is through the roof compared to any other American card, like an American Elite card. And I would not be surprised if this card gets nerfed in like a year and a half, 2 years. Come back to this video when this card gets nerfed and comment that you heard it here first. Then we get to Jasco. Jasco's an A tier card. It's really, really good at what it does. And what it does is pretty specific. However, its ability to just completely shut down Jagro with the Signal Regiment, or just like ridiculously reduce the amount of damage output that a US midrange or an air deck can deal, is just so incredible. Because US has very, very little healing. It has no guards. And this is a card that you can play out on one in any sort of like ramp or control deck. That's just going to instantly increase your win rate against anything aggressive by like probably a 2-digit percentage point. And yeah, there's not a whole lot else to say about this card. I mean, it's a 1-drop, it can easily be removed. It's not like Pioneers. It's not remotely as broken as Pioneer Regiment. Like, you sort of expect and kind of want it to be removed eventually, because it does take a spot in your support line while not doing a ton, but it just significantly shut down early aggression by such a large amount. Then we get to Long Tom. Long Tom is so bad. Oh my god. How is this not one of the cards that they haven't buffed? Because they haven't been getting around to buffing some of the like most awful cards in the game. Please give something to Long Tom. It's a 5-cost 2/4 artillery that does absolutely nothing the turn you play it. And when you attack with it, you deal 3 damage randomly split across enemies. Which is like occasionally better than a 5/4 artillery, and often significantly worse than a 5-cost 5/4 artillery. And obviously there is no 5-cost 5/4 artillery in the game, because that would be too highly statted. However, if you compare it to Sexton, which is a 3/4 artillery, so you already have 1 base attack up on the Long Tom, and it pins a unit the turn you play it. Potentially permanently. It permanently pins the unit as long as Sexton sticks on the board. That is like so much better. Oh, it is. Long Tom is just absolutely awful. This card is so terrible. Then we have the Marauder, which I think is a highly underrated card. I think this card is way better than a lot of people give it credit for. However, it's not great. It's not terrible. It's just not great. It's a little expensive to use. It's a little too easy to be removed. It's the same cost and stat line and everything as Catalina. However, it does have heavy armor, which is a huge benefit. The problem is its effect is not super useful. Because its effect is, if you attack the enemy HQ, increase the operation cost of all enemy units. Which can sometimes really, really work out if your opponent's like has a ton of infantry stuck in the support line. However, your opponent's probably, if your opponent's playing an aggro deck, they're gonna have a ton of units in the front line, or they are like artilleries or planes in the support line. And they're either going to kill this immediately, and if they can't, if you attack face, they will then kill it immediately the next turn, because you attacked face instead of trading. So that's sort of the problem with this. If you get an early bomber out, you want to attack the bomber into the enemy units. You don't want to attack face to make the enemy units weaker. So, yeah, I'm going to put it in maybe high C tier. Like, it would let me. Here we go. Maybe high C tier. Um, it's like a okay card. I actually think there is a just straight up 4-cost 3/4 bomber heavy armor card, which is basically just the same thing but without the effect. Would I ever consider running that? Not really. Um, yeah, I don't know. Then we have mass deployment. This card is pretty bad. I mean, it's a funny thing to say because this card gets a ton of play because this is just like a huge stat slap in a big ramp deck. Um, However, it is so substantially worse than like other huge stat slaps like B17F or Seaborne Invasion or Research. Um, the mass deployment is so hit or miss. You almost always just get absolute crap. You're basically running it for the value of getting 3 bodies from a single card. But more often than not, it is worse than Tractor Factories by a significant amount, and I don't think Tractor Factories is that good. Um, and I don't mean just like in terms of card for card. I literally mean like the 3 random units you get is usually worse than 2/5/5 blitz tanks. Um, so yeah, not a huge fan of mass deployment. I'm not saying that you should not run it in your ramp deck. Um, it is possible you would want to run this in your ramp deck. I just think it is so bad. And as soon as we get like new ramp cards in the next expansion, I think this is going to be like one of the first cards you got. This card is so bad. Um, Actually going to drop it over here to the bottom of C tier. Then we have the 5th Medical Battalion. This is going up to A. Now, this is a card which has not seen a ton of play recently. Notably, Birdo did bring it to the top 4 of the World Championship. He was playing a modified version of a list I brought to a previous OCC. You still see it in mid-range, just because the effect of this card is so incredibly powerful. Um, if you can protect this card, you can just straight up win any board against any board-based attack. However, you do need to be able to protect the card, and that is exclusively against other board-based decks. Um, how often that's going to happen, hard to tell, but just the potential of this card is incredibly high. I have to put it in A tier. I actually think it's better than Jasco. And actually, I think I'm going to put Jasco ahead of Catalina. I think I'm going to put Catalina at the bottom of A tier. So yeah, I think A tier looking like that. Then we have P40. P40 is a very good card. Gonna put it at the top of B, I think. So P40 is basically just like a better version of the Marauder. It's a 4/3 fighter for 4 with the passive effect whenever your opponent deploys a unit, or not deploys a unit, whenever your opponent like deploys or summons a unit, give it +2 operation. Which means if you go first and you play turn 2 War Machine and then you play P40 on turn 3 and your opponent misses a 1 and a 2 drop, you've almost certainly just won the game if they're playing any sort of like mid-range deck. Now, however, just with how deck building has gotten in the last like 2 years in this game, decks are there's way more consistently hitting a 1 and a 2. And with the nerf from 4 health to 3 health, this card did take a huge hit. However, if it's just like if your opponent has to trade into it, you're perfectly fine with that. There's very few aggressive decks that can easily deal with a 4/3 fighter. And if they can't kill it immediately, which isn't like a completely unreasonable situation to imagine, it's very quickly going to start snowballing out of control. Because unlike the Marauder, they have to trade into it, essentially. So I'm going to put it at the top of B tier, despite it seeing significantly less play than air defense. Like, I'm not saying it's going to, like, immediately fit into every deck. Actually, no, I'm going to put it down here. I think it's better than high-altitude bombing. Like, I think it's more likely to see play in the future than high-altitude bombing. And I think it can have more impact on a game than high-altitude bombing. well, actually that's untrue. I'm gonna move it one more down. I think it's still above Counterstrike, but yeah, I'm gonna move it there. Pretty decent card. Then we have Patton. Um, we're gonna put Patton right here in C tier. I can't say it's terrible, just because one cost, give any unit in the game Blitz, is never going to be terrible. Um, just because Blitz is one of the most powerful keywords in the game, and the ability to give essentially any unit in the game Blitz is always going to be fine. And then obviously there's some funny wombo combos, like if you have Patton plus 30 second, it lets you play out all 30 seconds for free on turn 1. There's some pretty funny things you can do with this card, but it's not that great. The problem is decks that utilize it on a lot of units are going to struggle to justify running it because of how, like the fact that it takes up a card slot. Like they're not going to be able to afford to have a card in their hand that like slightly discounts other cards in their hand. And a control deck probably just doesn't need it because they're either like they are rarely playing more than one unit in a turn, and if they are, they don't necessarily care about blitzing with it. So it's just sort of like a mediocre card with potential, like crazy potential in the future. And we have Pershing. Pershing I'm gonna put down in with the C tiers. Pershing is just like it's a card which can 100% immediately win you the game some of the time. However, it's so much slower than B17F, and you have to get it to the front line, which if it is just clogged, then it is clogged, and even if you get it to the front line, it's able to be targeted by orders. Or it like even if it's just retreated from the front line. Like if this card also just said can't be retreated or something like that, it would be marginally better. But again, 13 credits to deal 8 to the front line. Why wouldn't you just run 5th Rangers where it's 8 credits to deal 8 to the front line? Yeah, it's just a card that's gonna get slower and slower compared to other cards as in the future. Um, then we have PIR. PIR goes up into A tier. This card's just really, really good. If you play it on its own, it's a 4/3 smokescreen infantry, um, which is just kind of fine. And it's so many synergies with like Red Devil's 30 seconds. You can even just keep it smokescreened against some decks, and you will just be a constant +2 attack at the end of your turn to a random unit. And yeah, I don't think it's as good as Medical Battalion, just in terms of its ability to swing the game. Um, and it's just like a really, really good opener card. It's one of the few US elites which it's not like a situational card. It's just like a good card. Um, Obviously in a mid-range deck or an aggressive deck. This is not like a control card, but yeah, that's pretty clear by what the card does. Then we have Seaborne Invasion. I'm gonna put this card slightly above High Altitude Bombing in B tier. So Seaborne Invasion is 9 cost. Retreat all enemy units out of the front line, and in the front line summon 2 random US infantries with the combined attack of 6. So the randomness of this card is really, really frustrating. The worst you can get is 2 3/2 infantries. The best you can get is really depends on what you're looking for, but you can get a 6/6 Blitz plus Medical Battalion, which means you get a 7/6 Blitz that heals itself to full at the end of your turn if you have the credits to attack with it. A lot of games are determined by getting like a California off of this, and then just essentially killing whatever unit you want for free in the opponent's support line. And as they increasingly add more high health, low attack units, like 3/6s, 3/5s, 3/4s, that sort of stat line, this card gets better. However, if they add a lot more like one... Well, the problem with like if they add a 1/1 is it means you're getting a 5 attack unit, which is probably going to be a California. So it sort of evens out. So the stats you get is not really why you run this card, though. You run this card because it's 9 credits, retreat the front line, which acts as sort of like a Churchill Avre, a Leopold type of card against exclusively frontline decks. However, there's a decent, most decks in the game are frontline decks. There's only like Air and Artie are the exceptions. So 9 cost, retreat, and you summon stats to replace them, like to try to hold the front line. This is really great if you already have like a unit like a Grenadier Guards or something in the support line, where your opponent has like 5 units in the front line and you just slam Seaborne Invasion, retreat them all, probably a lot go to hand, and then you like move up like 10 health of units into the front line to hold it. That can be like easily the swinging point of a game. However, if your opponent's playing air, then this card kind of sucks. Um, and at 9 cost, aggro decks can easily kill you before then, and mid-range decks can usually afford, like if they play around it, they can usually afford to deal with the units and easily overcome the tempo. This is no Leopold. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Then we have Skytrain. Skytrain is, again, just a really, really good value generating card. 0/4 fighter. So it it being a fighter is actually really funny. I actually lost an OCC game once because um, I was dead on board. My opponent had like 1 health, and they top decked Skytrain to stop my Catalina. It was a US mid range mirror a long time ago. So it being a fighter is actually kind of funny. It used to be a bomber, and just generating the 1 cost units every turn, you can. We've even seen people experimenting with this card outside of mid range, like even in control, just because if you can get this protected behind like a C4th or a Grenadier Guards, you are generating tiny tokens to trade with your opponent's tiny tokens against like an aggro deck, which can do a lot. Now, obviously, with like 52k, it's hit a slightly. It's like getting kind of easier to deal with, and this does require that you have an ability to protect this card already, be that guards or units in the front line if you are a more aggressive mid-range deck. However, it's just a really good card. It's going to be interesting to see how this card evolves in the future. It really is dependent on what type of 1-drops they add. However, it's difficult to imagine that they would add enough 1-drops which are somehow also terrible enough that you would ever not run this card based on the quality of the 1-drops. So yeah, I think this is going to be a staple in US decks for the foreseeable future, and it's a very good card at that. Then we have Strategic Bombing. This is going to be a A-tier card. Again, I think I'm going to put it slightly behind Skytrain. Um, it's not anything special, but like all the credit slot removal cards are kind of decent. This is really US's. I mean, they have Stars and Stripes now, but this is sort of like the card they have to play around against US, sort of like Bombing Raid in Japan, Leopold in Germany. And yeah, it has some like interesting synergies, like Seaborne Invasion to retreat units to the support line, which then lets you strategic bombing, but obviously that's 15 credits. Um, I think Bombing Raid's biggest strength is that it deals damage to the HQ, which means it is a card you run in mid-range decks. I think if it didn't deal damage to the HQ, I don't think you would run it in mid-range decks. I think you would run like a one of Stars and Stripes, if at all. I've actually been cutting Stars and Stripes. And circling back, another great part of this dealing 3 damage is this triggers island hopping. So yeah, I think this card is just pretty good all-around value card. Whether you're playing it on curve, and you usually want to play it on curve, or you find it later in the game and swiping out a board from Brit Air. It's a card your opponent has to play around, and it's a card that's going to give you a pretty good bang for its buck in almost any situation. Then we have Strategic Planning, a 10-cost order, double the attack and defense of all units on the board. This is a terrible / not supported card. Leaning onto the not supported side of that, I'm going to put it... Okay, I'm going to put it here. It's above Long Tom. But not... I think it's Chaffy is actually better than it. The reason I'm putting it above Long Tom is Long Tom is just in need of a rework. Long Tom will never be good. Whereas Strategic Planning, could be good in the future if you have any sort of big order cost reductions or big order synergies. There's been a lot of talks about Japan getting potentially some big order synergy cards, since they have a lot of expensive orders, the cards that either reduce the cost of orders, like the next order you play is free, or I don't know, like heal an amount equal to the cost of the largest order in your hand. Like those types of cards. Um, if those types of cards become a thing, I could see a Japan ally ramp being a deck with strategic planning to buff like a board of huge like guards and like maybe a couple bombers. That's actually one of the first. That's literally like the when the first OCC was around, I was testing ramp decks because I was considering bringing ramp, and the deck that I considered bringing, and I think I played it in the Spoozes Nations Cup, like the very first Spoozes Nations Cup, to great success, was a Britain-Japan ramp deck with strategic planning. I just opened it from a pack. I was like, this card looks hilarious, and I like had like 3 Osaka regiments, and like we can do it, and then strategic planning, and suddenly I have like an 820 guard. I have like 2 820 guards. Um, but yeah, this is a super greedy win more card. It's way more greedy and win more than like mass deployment. However, its effect is one of the most extreme effects in the game, just in terms of like how much potential value you can get out of this. So that's why I'm not. I just don't think it's supported right now. Just with the way the game works, the way ramp works, it's not supported. But I think there's a possibility of it potentially being a niche card in a niche deck that is not terrible in the future. Then we have Super Fortress. This card's awful. Um, this card's going straight to D tier. I think I'm gonna put it above. I'll even put it above Chaffy. The one thing Super Fortress has going for it, it's a 15 cost, 9 and 9, 4 operation cost Blitz bomber with 2 heavy armor. That costs 12 to deploy if you control the front line. Now, the only thing this card has going for it is the ability to pull it out of your hand for cheap with Special Assignment, which is a 6 cost US order, choose a unit from your hand to deploy, or Western Allies, which is a 6 cost French order, deploy the top unit of your deck. Basically, those are like the only 2 things, and then past that, you have like some sick wombo combo synergies. Darkness and I tested potentially running this in a Italy ally very heavy ramp deck, and even then it just like wasn't that good. Yeah, this card is, it's just like the funny huge unit for like people who really love slapping huge units in like their ramp decks when they open this card, but this card has no place in the game competitively. Like, not quite, because there is just like niche decks that you can run it in, super niche decks, but yeah, this is just sort of like the pinnacle of funny bad ramp cards. Then we have US Research, which I'm going to put up at the top. The only card I think that is better, the only US Elite card which I think is better than Island Hopping, is in fact US Research, and if you've ever played against US, this should not be particularly surprising. Its tier 1 option, Depth Charges, is one of the most powerful don't die cards in the game. It's sort of like the closest equivalent to Ice Block in Hearthstone, if you're familiar with Hearthstone. Just give yourself Smokescreen is incredibly powerful, just because almost all decks currently deal their damage in the form of unit attacks. Or you can just play it on turn 3. If you miss a War Machine, that's fine. We actually saw Birdo play this on turn 3 for ramp in US midrange during the World Championship. It's tier 1 option. It's okay. It's probably the weakest of the 3. The 3 research tier 1 options. Its tier 2 option is basically just get an absolute ton of value. It gives you a super fortress and a high altitude bombing. It is just like the, do you want a ton of value? I think it's pretty silly, and I would like it to be reworked in the future. But yeah, it's just add high altitude bombing and super fortress to your hand. And I lost an OCC game 3 of an OCC quarterfinal because my opponent picked that option off of it instead of going for nukes, and it ended up winning him the game because I couldn't kill Super Fortress. And 2 high altitude bombers is always like fine. So that's by far the weakest of the options from US, and again, it's probably the weakest of the 3 research, like tier 2 research options. Um, then its third option is penicillin, which is draw 4 cards, heal 6, and give +6 health to all friendly units. It's basically just a massive we can do it. This card is insanely underrated. Well, I mean, I think any pro will tell you penicillin is great. It is crazy good. I just like, for some reason, like, I'm in so many situations where I'm like, man, I will lose to penicillin, and then my opponent goes for nukes. Everyone just sort of like tunnel visions on nukes. Penicillin is really good. I think it's the second best. I think the German tier 3 U-boat is slightly better, but penicillin's very good. I've won many a game off of penicillin. And it's sort of like, it's the largest single heal card in US. It's the largest single draw card in US, and it's in the form of a card you can reasonably run in any US deck. Well, any mid-range and up US deck. There's never really been a US aggro deck other than L640. Um, and then last but not least, the one we all know and love is nukes. Add 2 6-cost orders that deal 6 damage to all enemies. This is 12 damage burst. This is usually 2 full board wipes for half your credits. Nukes are ludicrously powerful. The number of games which are decided by nukes it's like probably like an easy like 15% of US mid-range games, and probably like 30-35% of US ramp games. Nukes is just like a way to absolutely shut out your opponent in the majority of decks. So yeah, and that's something I can't really see ever going away. This card is just so incredibly powerful. Nukes is by far the most powerful of the tier 4 options by such a ludicrous amount that despite having the worst tier 1 option and the worst tier 2 option, the strength of the tier 4 option is just enough to bring this card up. And this is a really good card in US mid-range, and that just goes to show how good this card is. Because you are using a card which you are exclusively sinking 18 credits into. If you go for the nukes, 40 credits into, in a aggressive mid-range deck. That just goes to show you how strong nukes are. Because it's just so easy to be in a position where it's like, it's turn 9 and you've run out of cards and your opponent's sort of taken the front line, and you just do research, and they now have 2 turns to kill you. And if they can't kill you in those 2 turns, the entire board is gone, which means they don't want to overcommit onto the board on the first turn that they have to kill you. Or you don't even have to go for research. Like, if they start hard playing around research, you can just do penicillin, heal 6, draw 4, and try to make a comeback with your newfound resources. So yeah, US research, just a ludicrously powerful card. And that is my US elite tier list. Let me know what you thought. If you want to make your own, there is a link to make your own in my Discord. You can also post your own list there on my Discord, or just let me know what you agree or disagree with in the comments. And yeah, let me know which tier list you want me to see me make next. I have Britain, Soviet, and Germany left to do. And yeah, with that, I'm going to end the video here. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Later, guys.